The story. 1. Shadows in the Wilderness, a scary camping story. Subscribe to Another World for great videos to relax, study, or just enjoy. It was the perfect summer night, or so it seemed. The air was warm but not stifling, and a gentle breeze whispered through the towering trees. It was the kind of night that beckoned you to leave your worries behind, forget the humdrum of everyday life, and immerse yourself in nature's stillness. 3 friends, Tim, Josh, and Rob, had decided to do just that. They had been planning this camping trip for weeks, lured by the promise of adventure and the thrill of doing something they shouldn't. The nature preserve they were headed to was massive, over 1,000 acres of untamed wilderness, and camping there was strictly forbidden. No official campsites, no rangers patrolling the grounds, just miles and miles of dense forest with only the occasional hiker to break the solitude. But that's what made it perfect. Tim, the most adventurous of the group, was always looking for the next big thrill. He was the one who had convinced the others that a night in the secluded preserve would be nothing short of exhilarating. Josh, on the other hand, was the cautious one, the voice of reason who had hesitated at first. But after enough badgering from Tim and a few beers, he had agreed to join. Then there was Rob, easygoing, always ready for a good time, but with a streak of wildness that came out only when the stars aligned just right. He had jumped at the chance for this illegal adventure. They packed up Rob's old Jeep with camping gear, a cooler of drinks, and a hefty supply of snacks. By the time they reached the preserve, it was nearing sunset. The forest loomed ahead of them like a dark green wall, impenetrable and mysterious. There was no marked trail where they were going. They had to park a mile from the nearest road and hike the rest of the way through thick underbrush. "This is going to be great," Tim said, a wide grin spreading across his face as he slung his backpack over his shoulder. "No rules, no people, just us and nature." Josh glanced at the fading sunlight and then at the dense woods ahead. "Yeah, no rules except the ones that keep us from getting lost," he muttered, though a small part of him couldn't help but feel a little excited. They hiked for nearly half an hour, the undergrowth slowing their progress. The further they went, the darker it became, and soon the only light came from the beams of their flashlights. Tim led the way, his industrial-grade flashlight slicing through the thick darkness like a knife. Rob and Josh followed close behind, the crunch of dry leaves and snapping twigs underfoot the only sounds in the otherwise silent woods. Finally, they found a small clearing, flat and just large enough for their tent. It wasn't much, but it would do. "This is perfect," Tim announced, dropping his pack and surveying the area. "We'll set up here." They worked together to pitch the tent, which, thanks to Tim's meticulous instructions, went up faster than they expected. Soon after, they had a fire crackling in the center of the clearing, the orange flames casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. Rob cracked open a beer and passed it around. The 3 of them settled into their camp chairs, the tension of the day melting away with each sip. For the first couple of hours, everything was perfect. They drank, talked, and laughed as the fire crackled and popped in front of them. The forest around them was alive with the usual sounds of nature, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. It felt like they were miles from civilization, completely alone in the heart of the wilderness. But then, just as the night was reaching that peaceful, drunken lull, something changed. It started with a whistle. The sound cut through the night air like a blade, sharp and piercing. It was loud but distant, as though it were coming from somewhere deep within the forest. Tim, who had been half asleep in his chair, jolted upright, his heart pounding in his chest. "What the hell was that?" Rob said, his voice low, but the edge of panic was clear. He was staring wide-eyed into the darkness beyond the campfire, his body tense. I don't know, Tim replied, scanning the trees with his flashlight. Maybe it's a bird or something. That wasn't a bird, Josh said, his voice shaking. He stood up, backing toward the tent as if that flimsy piece of fabric could protect him from whatever had made the noise. The whistle came again, louder this time, closer. It was a long, eerie note that hung in the air long after it stopped, sending a shiver down their spines. The firelight seemed to shrink, the shadows around them growing darker and more oppressive. Let's just stay calm, Tim said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. It's probably nothing. But the woods had gone unnervingly silent. The crickets had stopped chirping, the rustling leaves had stilled, and even the wind had seemed to die down. The only sound now was the crackling of the fire and the frantic beating of their hearts. For a long moment, the three of them just stood there, staring into the darkness, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The silence stretched on, becoming heavier, more suffocating. Finally, Rob broke the tension. Maybe we should put the fire out, he suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. It's attracting attention. Tim shook his head. No, we need the fire. It'll keep any animals away. Josh glanced at him, his face pale in the flickering light. That wasn't an animal, he said quietly. Before Tim could respond, something small flew through the darkness and landed directly in the fire with a soft thud. There was a brief moment of confusion before the firecracker exploded with a loud bang, sending sparks and embers flying in all directions. All three of them screamed, jumping to their feet and stumbling backward. Tim's flashlight dropped to the ground, the beam bouncing wildly as it hit the dirt. Rob bolted into the woods, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and Josh wasn't far behind him. "Wait! Don't run!" Tim shouted, scrambling to pick up the flashlight. But they were already gone, lost in the darkness. He swore under his breath and took off after them, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the trees as he ran. They didn't stop running until they were well away from the campsite, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. Tim's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the twisted branches of the trees, but there was no sign of anyone following them. The forest was once again silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. A heavier, more sinister one. "What the hell was that?" Rob panted, clutching his side. His face was pale and his eyes were wide with fear. "I don't know," Tim said, his voice strained, "but we need to go back." "Are you out of your mind?" Josh snapped. "There's something out there." Tim glanced back in the direction they had come. "We can't just leave everything behind," he argued. "The fire's still going. What if it spreads?" Josh shook his head. "I don't care about the fire, Tim. Something threw that firecracker. Someone is out there." Tim hesitated, torn between his instinct to run and his sense of responsibility. Finally, he nodded. "Okay, but we have to go back and at least check." Reluctantly, Rob and Josh agreed, and the three of them made their way back to the campsite. As they approached, the glow of the fire became visible through the trees. But something was wrong. The fire was still burning, but the clearing was no longer empty. Three figures sat motionless in their camp chairs, staring into the flames. Their faces were pale and expressionless, their eyes wide and unblinking. They were completely still, like statues, their mouths slightly open as if frozen mid-sentence. Tim's heart dropped into his stomach. "Oh my God," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "Who the hell are they?" Rob breathed, taking a step back. "I don't know," Tim said, his voice shaking. "But we need to get the hell out of here." They turned to leave, but Josh tripped over a rock, sending him sprawling to the ground with a loud crash. Instantly, the figures in the chairs turned their heads in unison, their eyes locking onto the three friends. The fire seemed to flicker and dim as the figures rose from their chairs, their movements slow and deliberate. "Run!" Tim shouted, yanking Josh to his feet. They took off into the woods, their footsteps crashing through the underbrush as the sound of footsteps followed close behind them. The figures were chasing them. They ran blindly through the forest, branches slapping against their faces and snagging their clothes. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, until it felt like the figures were right behind them. But no matter how fast they ran, the footsteps never seemed to fall behind. Finally, they burst out of the woods and into the clearing where they had parked the Jeep. They scrambled inside, slamming the doors shut and locking them. Tim jammed the keys into the ignition and the engine roared to life. He floored the gas, and the Jeep sped away from the forest, leaving the campsite and whatever had been chasing them behind. None of them spoke on the drive home. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the wind through the open windows. They were all lost in their own thoughts, trying to make sense of what had just happened. When they finally reached Tim's house, they sat in the driveway for a long time, staring out at the darkened street. "What the hell were those things?" Rob asked quietly. "I don't know," Tim said, his voice hollow, "but I'm not going back." The next day, however, Tim couldn't resist the pull of curiosity. He convinced Josh and Rob to return to the campsite during the day, reasoning that whatever had happened the night before was less likely to occur in broad daylight. They made their way back to the clearing, the morning sun filtering through the trees, casting long shadows on the forest floor. As they approached the campsite, the smell hit them first, a foul, putrid stench that made their stomachs churn. Tim unzipped the tent and recoiled in horror. Inside, lying on the ground, was a dead, rotting rat. Its body was bloated and disfigured, maggots crawling through its fur. The stench was overwhelming. Josh turned away, gagging. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice shaky. Tim nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching them, even now in the daylight. He looked around the clearing one last time, his eyes scanning the trees, but there was nothing there, just the forest, silent and still. They left the nature preserve that day, vowing never to return, but even as they drove away, the image of those lifeless figures sitting by the fire haunted their thoughts, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked in those woods. They had escaped, but something had been waiting for them in that forest, something that wasn't finished with them yet. And as the weeks passed, each of them began to feel it. That unsettling sensation of being watched, the faint sound of a distant whistle echoing in the back of their minds, a reminder that they hadn't left the forest behind. Not really, because some places, once visited, never let you go. The story 2, The Watcher. The night was hot, one of those humid summer nights that wrapped you in a sticky blanket of heat, clinging to your skin and making every breath feel like you were inhaling steam. Rick Reynolds hated nights like these, but they offered him an escape from his suffocating home life. 24 years old and still living under his parents' roof was not how he envisioned his life. His job at a dead-end tech startup barely paid the bills, let alone allowed him to move out and claim the freedom he so desperately craved. Home had become a battleground. His mother and father fought constantly, their voices ricocheting off the walls of their small house like bullets. They blamed each other for everything: money problems, lost opportunities, even his father's increasing drinking. Rick hated it. He hated the shouting, the tears, the endless cycle of blame and regret. More than anything, He hated the way they dragged him into it, making him the unwilling referee in their constant war. So, he did what he always did on nights like this. He left. Grabbing his gym bag, Rick slipped out the back door, the cool metal of the door handle offering a momentary reprieve from the heat. His destination was a park about a 10-minute drive from his house, a quiet spot at the top of a hill that overlooked the city. It had a workout facility, just some basic bars for pull-ups and dips. But it was enough for him. He liked working out at night when the park was empty, the cool breeze rolling in from the river offering a break from the relentless heat. It wasn't the exercise itself that he craved. It was the solitude, the silence. In the dead of night, when the world was quiet and still, Rick could forget about the chaos of his home life. For a little while, at least. His white Corolla sputtered to life as he turned the key in the ignition, the engine grumbling like it always did before finally roaring to life. He drove with the windows down, letting the warm air wash over him. The city streets were mostly empty, the occasional car or distant hum of a passing bus the only signs of life. When he arrived at the park, the lot was empty, as expected. He pulled into his usual spot, the old cracked asphalt beneath his tires familiar, comforting even. He killed the engine and grabbed his bag, stepping out into the thick summer air. The park was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Usually, there were at least the sounds of crickets or the rustling of leaves in the breeze, but tonight it was silent, dead silent. Rick shrugged off the unease that had started to creep up his spine. It was late, that was all. He tossed his gym bag on the ground near the pull-up bar and stretched, his muscles already tight from the tension he carried in his shoulders and neck. He jumped up, grabbed the bar, and began his first set of pull-ups, the rhythmic motion of his body moving up and down helping to calm his racing thoughts. As he finished his second set and dropped down to the ground, he felt it, that prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. He spun around, his eyes scanning the shadows. There was no one. The park was still empty, the trees swaying gently in the faint breeze. But the feeling didn't go away. His skin tingled, and his pulse quickened as if his body knew something his mind hadn't caught up to yet. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. He moved to the dip bars, deciding to shake off the eerie feeling with another set. He had barely started when he heard a soft shuffling sound behind him. He froze. "Nice night for a workout, huh?" Rick's heart leapt into his throat. He whipped around, and there, standing less than a foot away from him, was a man. The stranger was tall, lanky, his skin pale in the moonlight. His clothes were disheveled, and his face looked battered, as though he'd been in a fight and lost. There was something familiar about him, but Rick couldn't place it. "Jesus, man," Rick gasped, stepping back. "You scared the hell out of me." The man chuckled, a dry, raspy sound that made Rick's skin crawl. "Sorry about that," the man said, though his smile didn't seem apologetic at all. "Didn't mean to sneak up on you. I've seen you here before, you know? You come here a lot." Rick's stomach twisted. Yeah, I guess," he said cautiously. "I like working out at night." The man nodded, his eyes fixed on Rick, with an intensity that made him want to turn and run. "You're pretty strong," the man continued, his voice oddly calm, almost conversational. "Maybe you could teach me a thing or two." Rick didn't like this, not one bit. There was something off about this guy. His eyes, the way they bored into him, the strange familiarity. It all set Rick on edge. I'm just about done here," Rick said, turning away, hoping the guy would get the hint. Maybe another time. He grabbed his bag, ready to bolt. But then the man said something that made Rick's blood run cold. "See you later, Rick." Rick froze, his hand clenched around the strap of his bag. How did this guy know his name? He turned slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. The man was still standing there, that eerie smile still plastered on his face. "What did you say?" Rick asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man's smile widened, his eyes glinting in the moonlight. "I said, 'See you later, Rick.'" Rick's stomach lurched. He didn't know this man. He had never seen him before in his life. And yet, without another word, Rick slung his bag over his shoulder and hurried back to his car. He didn't look back. He didn't want to. His hands were shaking as he fumbled with the keys, finally jamming them into the ignition and starting the car. He sped out of the parking lot, his heart pounding in his chest. The image of that man's face burned into his mind. When he got home, the house was dark. His parents had either gone to bed or passed out from exhaustion, and for once, Rick was grateful for the silence. He locked the door behind him and went straight to his room, the encounter replaying over and over in his mind. How had the man known his name? Was it just a coincidence? Maybe he'd heard it somewhere before, from someone at the park. Rick tried to rationalize it, but the more he thought about it, the less sense it made. The man had looked at him like he knew him, like he had been watching him for a long time. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time Rick closed his eyes, he saw the man's face, that strange smile, the way he had said his name like they were old friends. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with questions he didn't want to answer. The next morning, Rick woke up groggy and irritable. He had barely slept, and his body ached from the restless night. As he stumbled into the kitchen to make coffee, he noticed something on the floor near the front door. It was an envelope. There was no address, no name, just a plain, unmarked envelope lying on the mat. Rick frowned, picking it up and tearing it open. Inside were several photographs. His heart stopped. The photos were of him. There was one of him leaving his house, one of him at the park working out, one of him walking to his car. And then, Rick's hands trembled as he flipped through the last photo. It was of him, lying in bed, asleep. His stomach twisted in knots and he felt bile rising in his throat. Someone had been watching him. Someone had been in his house while he slept. The room spun around him as panic set in. He dropped the photos on the kitchen counter, backing away as though they might bite him. His mind raced. Who had taken these? Was it that man from the park? How had he gotten into the house? Rick stumbled back to his room and locked the door. His thoughts were a whirlwind of fear and confusion. He couldn't go to the police. What would he tell them? That a creepy guy at the park knew his name and someone had taken pictures of him? They'd laugh him out of the station. But the photos, those were real. Rick spent the rest of the day in a haze, unable to focus on anything. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the photos, saw himself, vulnerable, sleeping while someone stood over him, camera in hand. He kept checking the windows, the locks, the corners of the room, convinced that someone was watching him. That night, he couldn't bring himself to go to the park. The thought of running into that man again, or worse, finding him waiting there for him, was too much. He stayed in his room, the curtains drawn tight, his heart racing with every sound he heard. At around 3 a.m, just as he was finally drifting off to sleep, there was a knock at the door. Rick sat up in bed, his heart pounding. The knock came again, louder this time. He threw off the covers and crept to the door, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Who's there?" he called, his voice shaking. No answer. He pressed his ear to the door, listening. Nothing. For a long moment, Rick stood there, frozen, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Then, slowly, he unlocked the door and opened it a crack. There was no one there. But lying on the floor, just outside the door, was another envelope. Rick's hands shook as he picked it up. He didn't want to open it, but he had to. His fingers fumbled with the seal, tearing it open to reveal another set of photographs. These were different. They weren't just of him this time. They were of his parents, his mother at the kitchen table, his father asleep on the couch, and in every photo there was a note written in the corner in red ink. "I'm watching." Rick dropped the envelope, his chest tightening with fear. His hands went numb, and his knees buckled as he slumped against the wall. This was more than just some creepy guy at the park. This was something worse. Something much worse. He had to go to the police. He had no choice. The next morning, Rick drove to the station, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He felt like a fool walking up to the counter and explaining what had happened, but the officer on duty took him seriously. They took the photos, asked him some questions, and assured him they would investigate. But Rick could see it in their eyes. They didn't believe him. They thought he was paranoid, maybe even a little crazy. Days passed, and the knocks at the door continued. Every night, like clockwork, at 3 in the morning. Rick stopped sleeping, his mind a whirl of paranoia and fear. He couldn't escape it. Everywhere he went, he felt eyes on him, watching, waiting. More notes appeared, sometimes slipped under the door, other times left on his car, each one more cryptic than the last. "You can't hide. I see you." Rick stopped going to the park, stopped leaving the house unless it was absolutely necessary. He became a prisoner in his own home, constantly checking the windows, the locks, the corners of the room. He knew he was being watched. He just didn't know by whom. The police never found anything. They told him there were no leads, no fingerprints, no evidence. It was as if the person stalking him didn't exist. But Rick knew better. He could feel it. The presence, the weight of those eyes on him, never left. It was only a matter of time before they came for him, and when they did, there would be no escape. The Story 3. The Masked Men Return. Rick Baxter didn't want to go to the party. He had every reason not to. For one, he didn't really know Randy all that well. They had mutual friends, sure, and had passed each other in the hallways at college plenty of times, but that was the extent of it. Randy wasn't the type of guy Rick normally hung out with. Too loud, too confident, and always surrounded by people. Rick wasn't like that. He was quieter, more comfortable in the background than at the center of attention. But then, his best friend Philip had called him out of the blue that afternoon saying, "Hey, there's a party at Randy's place tonight. You in?" Rick hesitated. He didn't feel like drinking, didn't feel like standing around awkwardly in some stranger's house pretending to have a good time. But Philip was relentless, and Rick didn't have anything else to do. He figured a couple of hours wouldn't hurt, so there he was, driving through the winding suburban streets on a humid summer night, following the directions to Randy's house. He couldn't deny that the neighborhood was nice. Big houses with well-manicured lawns, the kind of place where everything seemed perfect on the surface. It was almost unsettling, the way everything looked so pristine, like it was hiding something darker underneath. He pulled up to Randy's house, a massive colonial-style place at the end of the street. There were already a dozen cars parked out front, and the faint thumping of music drifted through the open windows. Rick parked his old Corolla and sat for a moment, watching as a group of people walked up the driveway, laughing and already a little tipsy. Rick sighed. He didn't belong here, but there was no turning back now. He got out of the car and headed inside. The house was just as impressive on the inside as it was from the outside. High ceilings, hardwood floors, and expensive-looking furniture. The kind of house where people had money, lots of it. Rick felt out of place from the moment he stepped in the door, but Philip greeted him with a beer and a grin, clapping him on the back like everything was fine. "Glad you made it, man," Philip said, already a little drunk. "This party is insane. Randy's got the best booze, and the girls here, dude, you have to check them out." Rick forced a smile, but the truth was, he wasn't interested in girls or booze. He just wanted to get through the night and go home. The party was exactly what he expected. Loud music, people everywhere, some dancing, some making out, and others passed out on the couches or floors. Rick wandered through the house, holding his beer and trying to look like he was having fun. But he wasn't. Not even close. After an hour of pretending to enjoy himself, Rick decided he'd had enough. He didn't want to make a scene by leaving too early, so he found a staircase leading up to the second floor and slipped away from the chaos. Maybe he could find a quiet room to sit in for a while until it was acceptable to leave. He climbed the stairs and found himself in a hallway lined with doors. Most of them were closed, but one at the end of the hall was slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of him, and Rick pushed the door open, finding himself in a small attic room. It wasn't much, just some old furniture and a window that looked out over the backyard, but it was quiet, and that was enough for Rick. He walked over to the window and pushed it open, letting the cool night air wash over him. The noise from the party was distant now, just a dull throb in the background. He could see the roof of the house stretching out in front of him, the shingles glowing faintly in the moonlight. For a moment, Rick considered climbing out onto the roof to get a better view. He wasn't drunk enough to do something that stupid, but the idea lingered. And then he saw them. Two figures, dressed in dark clothes, faces obscured by masks, creeping along the edge of the roof. They were moving cautiously, clearly trying not to be seen. And for a second, Rick thought they were just part of the party, some stupid prank or dare. But then he saw the bags they were carrying, heavy-looking duffel bags slung over their shoulders. These weren't partygoers. These were burglars. Rick's heart leapt into his throat as he realized what he was seeing. They were breaking into the house, probably through one of the upstairs windows. His first instinct was to shout, to alert someone, but fear clamped his throat shut. What if they heard him? What if they saw him? He ducked down, peering through the crack of the open window, watching as the two burglars reached one of the windows and pried it open with a crowbar. They slipped inside the house, disappearing into the shadows. Rick's mind raced. He had to do something. Call the police? Run downstairs and tell someone? But his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. He couldn't move, couldn't think straight. He just kept staring at the open window, his breath coming in shallow gasps. And then, one of the burglars reappeared. He climbed out of the window, one of the duffel bags slung over his shoulder, and started making his way back across the roof. Rick panicked. He couldn't just let them get away. His legs moved before his brain could catch up, and before he knew it, he was climbing out of the window and onto the roof. The shingles were rough under his hands, and his heart pounded in his chest as he crept closer to the burglar. The burglar hadn't noticed him yet. He was too focused on getting away. Rick felt a surge of adrenaline. This was his chance. He could stop them. "Hey!" Rick shouted, his voice shaky but loud enough to get the burglar's attention. The man spun around, his eyes wide behind the mask. For a moment, they just stared at each other. And then the burglar bolted, running across the roof toward the edge. Rick chased after him, his feet slipping on the shingles, but he didn't slow down. He wasn't thinking anymore, just acting on pure instinct. He couldn't let this guy get away. The burglar reached the edge of the roof and hesitated for a split second, looking down at the drop below. That hesitation was all Rick needed. He lunged forward, grabbing the burglar by the arm. The man cursed, trying to shake him off, but Rick held on, his fingers digging into the man's sleeve. For a moment, they struggled, teetering on the edge of the roof, and then the burglar's foot slipped. Rick watched in horror as the man tumbled backward, his arms flailing as he fell off the roof. There was a sickening thud as he hit the ground below, and Rick felt his stomach lurch. He didn't move. He couldn't. He just stood there, staring down at the motionless body on the ground, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The sound of sirens snapped him out of his daze. Someone must have called the police. Rick climbed back through the window, his hands shaking as he made his way downstairs. By the time he reached the front door, the police were already there, lights flashing, and people spilling out of the house to see what was going on. Randy was standing on the front porch looking confused and more than a little drunk. When he saw Rick, his eyes widened. "Dude, what the hell happened?" Rick opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out. He just shook his head, the events of the night swirling in his mind like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The police swarmed the house, securing the area and questioning everyone. The burglar who had fallen off the roof was alive, but barely. He was unconscious, his body twisted in an unnatural angle, and the paramedics rushed him to the hospital. The other burglar, however, had vanished. He'd slipped away during the chaos, disappearing into the night. The police questioned Rick, asking him for every detail of what had happened. He told them everything, the burglars, the struggle, the fall, but it all felt surreal, like he was telling someone else's story. Eventually, the party broke up. The guests trickled away, and Randy's house, once filled with music and laughter, was now eerily quiet. Rick stayed behind, sitting on the porch with Randy as the police finished their investigation. "You're a hero, man," Randy said, clapping Rick on the back. "If you hadn't seen those guys, they could have gotten away with everything." Rick didn't feel like a hero. All he felt was numb. The next few days were a blur. The police followed up with Rick, asking him more questions, but there was little to go on. The burglar who had fallen was in critical condition, but he wasn't talking. And the other one? He was gone, like a ghost. Rick tried to put the whole thing behind him. He tried to go back to his normal life, to forget about the party and the roof and the masked burglars. But it wasn't that easy. A few weeks after the incident, Randy called him. He sounded shaken, his usual confident tone replaced with something darker. "Hey man, I need to talk to you. Something weird's been happening since that night." Rick's stomach tightened. He didn't want to hear it, didn't want to know what was going on, but Randy was insistent. They met at a coffee shop, and Randy slid an envelope across the table to Rick. "Take a look at this," Randy said, his voice low. Rick opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of photos. His blood ran cold as he flipped through them. They were pictures of Randy's house, taken from different angles, some from the street, some from the backyard. But the most disturbing ones were taken from inside the house. There were photos of Randy's family, his parents, his sister, going about their daily lives, completely unaware that someone was watching them. "Where did these come from?" Rick asked, his voice barely a whisper. "They just showed up in our mailbox," Randy said, running a hand through his hair. "No return address, no note, just these." Rick stared at the photos, his mind racing. This wasn't a coincidence. This had something to do with the burglars. The one who had gotten away. He was still out there, and now he was watching Randy's family. "We've been getting letters too," Randy continued, threatening ones. "They don't say much, just stuff like, 'I'm watching' and 'you'll pay.' We've gone to the police, but there's not much they can do. No fingerprints, no evidence." Rick felt a cold knot of fear settle in his stomach. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. "What are you going to do?" Rick asked, his voice tight. Randy shrugged. "We've installed security cameras, reinforced the doors and windows. My dad even hired a security company to do nightly patrols around the house. But I don't know, man. I can't shake the feeling that something bad is going to happen." Rick didn't know what to say. He wanted to tell Randy that everything would be fine, that it was just some psycho trying to scare them, but he couldn't. He didn't believe it himself. As the months passed, the letters and photos continued. Randy's family lived in a constant state of fear, never knowing when the next threat would come or if the burglar would make good on his promises. The police kept investigating, but they were always one step behind, unable to catch the elusive man who had slipped away that night. Rick tried to distance himself from the whole thing. He tried to forget about the party, the burglars, and the strange creeping sense of dread that followed him everywhere he went. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape it. One night, Rick was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when he heard a knock at the door. It was soft, barely audible, but it sent a chill down his spine. He sat up, listening. The knock came again, louder this time. Rick got out of bed, his heart pounding in his chest. He crept to the door and peered through the peephole. There was no one there, but when he opened the door, he found an envelope lying on the ground. His hands trembled as he picked it up and tore it open. Inside were more photos. Photos of him. There was one of him sitting in his car, one of him walking into his apartment, and one of him sleeping in his bed. And in the corner of each photo, written in red ink, were the words, "I'm watching." The Night the Forest Whispered. A scary camping story. Subscribe to Another World for great videos to relax, study, or just enjoy. The trees towered over them like silent sentinels, casting long, crooked shadows over the small clearing. The air was cool, not cold, but cool enough to remind you that nature was bigger, stronger, and older than any person could fathom. It had been the perfect place for the Andrews family to camp, or so they thought when they arrived. John Andrews, a man in his early 40s with a stocky build and an optimistic smile, was the one who chose this spot deep in the New Hampshire woods. He had been here before, many years ago, back when he was a Boy Scout with his father. The memories of long summer days, roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories by the fire were vivid in his mind as he pitched the tent for his family that evening. His wife Sarah had been more reluctant. She had her reservations about camping, always preferring the comforts of home over the untamed wild. But John convinced her. How could a couple of nights in the forest hurt? They had their son, Ethan, with them. At 12 years old, Ethan was at that age where adventure excited him, and the great outdoors seemed like the perfect playground. Even their family cat Whiskers had snuck into the car at the last minute, as if it too wanted a taste of the wilderness. It was unlike Whiskers to show such boldness, usually content to slink around the house, but Sarah found it amusing. She decided not to let John know about the stowaway until they arrived. John had always hated the cat, finding its sharp green eyes unnerving. So there they were, the four of them, John, Sarah, Ethan, and the uninvited Whiskers, setting up camp as the late afternoon sun dipped behind the trees. John went about making a fire while Ethan gathered sticks, and Sarah laid out the sleeping bags inside the large family tent. Everything felt just as it should be. Serene, peaceful, and disconnected from the world of cell phones and email. But as the sun sank lower, the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch longer, reaching out like skeletal fingers. Sarah noticed it first. She had been unpacking their supplies when she froze, her hand still gripping a bag of marshmallows. "John?" she called, her voice slightly shaky. "Yeah?" John replied, looking up from the fire pit he was building. "Do you hear that?" John stood still for a moment, listening. Nothing but the usual sounds of the forest, A rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, and the soft wind blowing through the branches. He smiled and shook his head. Just the woods, hon. It's all part of the camping experience. Sarah didn't respond right away. She was still listening, her ears attuned to something more subtle. There it was again, a faint shuffling noise, almost like footsteps, but slower, more deliberate. She brushed it off as nerves. Maybe it was just a deer or a raccoon moving through the brush. She didn't want to sound paranoid. By the time the fire was crackling and they were roasting marshmallows, the odd sound had faded into the background. Ethan was excitedly telling his parents about a history lesson he learned in school, something about the old logging towns that once existed in the area. His excitement was infectious, and for a while, John and Sarah forgot their worries. But as the sky turned dark and the thick canopy of trees above them blocked out the stars, the strange noises returned. This time, there was no denying it. The soft shuffle in the bushes, a twig snapping underfoot, the eerie feeling of being watched. John was the first to speak. "Did you hear that?" Sarah nodded, her face pale in the firelight. "Yes, I've been hearing it for a while." Ethan, oblivious to the tension, looked around excitedly. "Maybe it's a bear," he said, grinning. John shook his head. "No, it's too quiet for a bear. Probably just an animal passing through." But then came a new sound, a low growl, deep and guttural, reverberating through the trees. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. It made the hairs on the back of John's neck stand on end. Sarah clutched Ethan's arm instinctively. "We should go inside the tent," she whispered. John nodded, his carefree attitude quickly vanishing. He helped Ethan gather their things as they hurried into the tent. Inside, they zipped the flap shut and huddled together. The growling had stopped, but the oppressive silence that followed was almost worse. "Maybe it's a wolf," Ethan suggested in a hushed voice, clearly more excited than afraid. "There aren't any wolves around here," John replied, though he didn't sound convinced. His mind raced with possibilities. A coyote? A wild dog? But the growl had sounded larger, more menacing, and it wasn't the sound of something curious. It was the sound of something territorial. The minutes ticked by in silence. Every now and then, John or Sarah would glance toward the tent flap, half expecting to see a shadow move across it. But nothing came. The night was unnervingly still, save for the occasional creak of the trees swaying in the wind. Then, just as they were beginning to calm down, the tent shook violently. Ethan yelped in surprise, and Sarah stifled a scream. John jumped to his feet, instinctively reaching for the hatchet they had brought for chopping wood. The tent shook again, more forcefully this time, as if something large and heavy had brushed against it. "What the hell?" John muttered under his breath, his grip tightening around the hatchet handle. The growl returned, louder now, closer. It rumbled through the ground beneath them, vibrating the air inside the tent. Sarah's eyes were wide with terror, and Ethan had gone silent, his bravado from earlier completely gone. For a moment, they were frozen in place, too scared to move. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the growling stopped. The tent stopped shaking, and the forest went quiet again. They waited, holding their breath, listening for any sign of movement outside. But there was nothing. Just the gentle rustle of the leaves and the crackling of the dying fire outside. "What do you think it was?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. John didn't answer right away. He didn't know. Part of him wanted to believe it was just an animal passing by, something curious about their camp. But deep down, he had a sinking feeling that it wasn't that simple. "I'll check it out," he finally said, though the last thing he wanted to do was step outside that tent. "No," Sarah grabbed his arm. "Don't go out there." John hesitated, torn between his instinct to protect his family and the overwhelming fear gnawing at his gut. But he knew they couldn't just stay huddled in the tent all night, paralyzed by fear. They needed to know what was out there. Slowly, carefully, he unzipped the tent flap just enough to peer outside. His heart raced in his chest as he scanned the clearing. The fire was still burning low, casting flickering shadows across the trees. But nothing seemed out of place. No sign of any large animal, no glowing eyes staring back at him from the darkness. He exhaled in relief and turned back to his family. "It's clear," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Probably just a raccoon or something." But Sarah wasn't convinced. She had heard that growl, and she knew raccoons didn't make sounds like that. Neither did deer or coyotes, for that matter. She pulled Ethan closer, her eyes darting nervously around the tent. John stepped outside, keeping the hatchet close, and circled the campsite. He checked the perimeter, looking for tracks or any sign of what might have been lurking nearby. But there was nothing. No footprints, no disturbed earth, nothing out of the ordinary. He was about to head back inside when something caught his eye: movement in the trees. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but then he saw it again. A dark shape flitting between the trunks, barely visible in the dim light. His heart skipped a beat, and he took a step back, his hand tightening around the hatchet. Whatever it was fast, too fast to be any ordinary animal. He squinted, trying to get a better look, but the shape had already disappeared into the underbrush. John hurried back to the tent and zipped it up behind him. "I didn't see anything," he lied, not wanting to scare Sarah and Ethan more than they already were. But the truth was, he had seen something, and whatever it wasn't natural. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. None of them slept. They sat huddled together in the tent, listening to every creak and rustle outside, jumping at every little sound. But nothing else happened. No more growling, no more shaking. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, they finally felt a sense of relief. John stepped outside to find the fire long dead, the clearing bathed in the soft glow of morning. The forest looked peaceful again, as if nothing had happened. But as they began packing up their things, preparing to leave, Ethan noticed something strange. He pointed to the ground near the edge of the clearing, where the dirt had been disturbed. John knelt down to take a closer look. There, in the soft earth, were deep, clawed footprints, far too large to belong to any animal in these woods. John stared at the prints, his heart pounding in his chest. They were unmistakably fresh, large, deep indentations with sharp claw marks dug into the soft earth. His breath quickened, and he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. They didn't belong to a bear or a wolf. No animal he knew of left prints like these. Ethan crouched beside him, his eyes wide with curiosity, though tinged with fear. "Dad, what kind of animal leaves tracks like that?" he asked, his voice filled with both wonder and nervous energy. John swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. I don't know, son." His mind raced as he stood up, scanning the forest around them. The dense trees seemed to close in, and the sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the tree line, came flooding back. Whatever had growled at them in the night had been far more than just a raccoon or a deer. He turned to Sarah, who stood by the tent, her face pale, holding Whiskers tightly against her chest. The cat, usually so calm, was tense, ears flattened and tail puffed up, clearly sensing something was wrong. "We should pack up and leave," John said, trying to keep his voice steady. He didn't want to panic his family, but every instinct told him they needed to get out of these woods. Now. Sarah didn't argue. She had seen the fear in John's eyes the night before, and the sight of those footprints was enough to convince her that something was terribly wrong. Together, They began to break down the camp in hurried silence, the atmosphere thick with tension. Ethan, usually so full of energy, was uncharacteristically quiet. He helped pack up his things without complaint, his eyes constantly darting to the trees around them. He had always loved the idea of adventure, but this felt like something out of the stories his friends told at sleepovers, the ones that kept him awake at night. As they worked, John couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end, and every rustle of leaves or creak of a branch sent a jolt of fear through him. But each time he glanced into the woods, he saw nothing, no movement, no sign of whatever had made those tracks. Still, the feeling persisted, gnawing at him, making his hands tremble as he packed. Finally, with everything loaded into the car, they climbed in, and John started the engine. The sound of the car revving to life was a welcome relief, breaking the eerie silence that had settled over the clearing. John threw the car into drive, eager to put as much distance between them and this place as possible. As they drove down the winding dirt road that led out of the woods, Ethan looked out the window, his brow furrowed in thought. "Dad," he said after a long silence, "do you think it was a ghost?" John glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "A ghost?" Ethan nodded. "I mean, it didn't sound like an animal, and those footprints, they looked like something from a monster movie." John hesitated, not sure how to answer. He didn't believe in ghosts, or at least he hadn't before last night. But now, with the memory of that growl still fresh in his mind, he wasn't so sure. "I don't know, buddy," he said finally. "But whatever it was, we're safe now." They drove in silence for a few more minutes, the dense trees thinning out as they neared the main road. Just as John began to relax, a movement in the trees caught his eye. He glanced to his left, and his blood turned to ice. There, running parallel to the car, was a dark shape. It was fast, unnaturally fast, moving through the underbrush with a speed that no animal should have. It was large, hulking, and its movements were jerky, almost as if it was stalking them. "John, what is it?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with fear as she noticed him staring out the window. He didn't answer. His foot pressed harder on the gas, the car accelerating as he tried to put more distance between them and the thing in the woods. But no matter how fast he drove, the shape kept pace, moving with an eerie, unnatural grace through the trees. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The forest was still again, the only sound the hum of the car's engine and the thudding of John's heart in his chest. He exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath, and glanced in the rearview mirror. Ethan was staring out the back window, his face pale. "Did you see that?" he whispered. John nodded, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I saw it." They reached the main road, and John turned onto the highway, relief flooding through him as the trees gave way to open fields. But the fear didn't leave him. It clung to him like a second skin, a constant reminder of the dark presence that had followed them out of the woods. As they drove, Sarah finally spoke. "John, what do you think that was?" He shook his head, his mind racing. "I don't know. But whatever it wasn't natural." They didn't speak much for the rest of the drive. The tension in the car was palpable, and even Whiskers remained unusually quiet, curled up in Sarah's lap, eyes half closed but alert. When they finally arrived home, it was a relief to be back in the familiar surroundings of their suburban neighborhood. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and the nightmare of the previous night seemed distant, almost like a bad dream. But as John unloaded the car, his mind kept drifting back to the footprints, the growling, and the dark shape in the woods. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them, that the woods weren't done with them yet. Later that night, after Sarah and Ethan had gone to bed, John found himself sitting in the living room, staring out the window. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling. But then, just as he was about to head upstairs to join his family, he heard it. A low growl. It was faint, barely audible but unmistakable. His heart raced as he stood up, his eyes scanning the darkness outside the window. And there, just beyond the tree line at the edge of their yard, he saw it. A pair of glowing eyes watching him from the shadows. John froze, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment, he thought he was imagining it, that the fear from the woods had followed him home in his mind. But then the growl came again, louder this time, and the eyes blinked. Whatever it was, it had followed them, and it wasn't going to let them go. The Lake of Shadows, a scary camping story. Subscribe to Another World for great videos to relax, study, or just enjoy. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the still water of Lake Reverence. Stephen Warner sat by the crackling campfire, the flames flickering and dancing in the growing darkness. This place, this very spot by the lake, was once where his family would come every summer when he was a child. He remembered the smell of pine needles underfoot, the laughter of his father, the hum of cicadas. But that was before. Before the accident, before life became something dark and distant. It had been 5 years since his father died, the man who had taught him everything, how to fish, how to build a fire, how to face the world with confidence, was gone. His passing had been sudden, unexpected, leaving behind a void that Stephen had never quite managed to fill. And here he was now, back at the lake, trying to find something he had lost, something he couldn't quite name. The air was still, almost unnaturally so. No birds, no insects, just the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. The fire popped, sending tiny embers into the sky, their light vanishing into the thickening night. Stephen shivered, though not from the cold. A sense of unease crept over him, something he couldn't shake off no matter how hard he tried. It was as if the lake itself was watching him, waiting for him to make a move. His thoughts drifted to his father, how they would sit by the fire, just like this, telling stories or simply enjoying the quiet. He could almost hear his father's voice, deep and comforting, like the low rumble of thunder in the distance. But that voice was gone, taken away with him 5 years ago, buried under 6 feet of earth. Stephen sighed, running a hand through his hair. The firelight reflected off the lake, casting an orange glow on the water's surface. It was peaceful in a way, but the peace felt hollow, like the calm before a storm. He stood, stretching his legs, and decided to take a walk along the shoreline. Maybe that would help clear his head, shake off this odd feeling of being watched. As he walked, the gravel crunched beneath his boots, the sound loud in the oppressive silence. The lake was a black mirror now, perfectly still, reflecting the darkening sky. Trees loomed overhead, their branches stretching out like skeletal arms. Stephen felt a chill run down his spine, though the air was still warm. Something was off about tonight, something he couldn't put his finger on. Then, just as he was about to turn back to his campfire, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Across the lake, standing on the opposite shore, was a figure, a man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his silhouette unmistakable even in the dim light. Stephen's heart skipped a beat, his breath catching in his throat. It was his father. For a moment, Stephen thought he was seeing things. Maybe it was the light playing tricks on him, the shadows cast by the trees. But no, it was him. There was no mistaking the outline of that body, the way he stood with his hands in his pockets, just like he used to when he was waiting for something. "Dad?" Stephen whispered, though his voice barely carried over the water. The figure didn't move, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge him at all. He just stood there, staring across the lake. Stephen felt his legs go weak, his mind racing to make sense of what he was seeing. His father was dead. He had been dead for 5 years. There was no way, no possible way, this could be real. But he was there, as real as the ground beneath Stephen's feet. Stephen wanted to run, to scream, but he couldn't move. His feet were rooted to the spot, as if the ground itself was holding him in place. He watched in horror as the figure raised a hand and pointed, to the lake, to something in the water. Stephen followed his father's gesture, his eyes drawn to the still surface of the lake. There, bobbing gently in the water, was a small wooden box. It was old, weathered, and covered in moss, as if it had been lying at the bottom of the lake for years. His heart pounded in his chest. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew, deep down, instinctively, that he had to get that box. Slowly, as if in a trance, Stephen began to move. His feet carried him to the water's edge where the box floated just out of reach. Without thinking, he waded into the lake, the cold water soaking through his jeans and boots. The box bobbed closer, almost as if it was coming to him. When he reached it, he pulled it from the water. It was heavier than he expected, the wood swollen and creaking from years of being submerged. He stumbled back to the shore, clutching the box in his hands, and sat down, staring at it. His father was gone. The figure on the opposite shore had vanished, as if it had never been there in the first place. Stephen's hands trembled as he pried open the box. The hinges creaked, and the smell of damp wood and earth filled his nostrils. Inside, wrapped in old cloth, were photographs. Black and white pictures of his father as a young man. There were letters, too, their edges yellowed with age. And nestled at the bottom of the box was a fishing lure. His father's favorite, the one he always used when they fished together. Tears welled in Stephen's eyes as he pulled the lure from the box. The memories flooded back. Days spent on the lake. The two of them, side by side, casting their lines into the water, waiting for the fish to bite. He had forgotten how much he missed those days, how much he missed his father. But now, holding the lure in his hand, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. It was as if his father was there with him, watching over him, guiding him even now. Stephen looked up at the lake, at the spot where his father had stood. The water was calm, reflecting the night sky. He didn't know how or why, but he knew one thing for sure. His father was still with him. The peace that washed over Stephen was short-lived. As he sat there, clutching his father's old fishing lure, something in the air shifted. The tranquility of the moment seemed to peel away like layers of paint from an old house, revealing something darker underneath. He could feel it. A presence. Something watching him from the shadows that clung to the trees around the lake. The fire crackled weakly behind him, but it no longer provided any comfort. The warmth it once gave off felt distant, as though it belonged to another place, another time. The box still sat on his lap, and Stephen stared at its contents, those letters, those photos, the lure that once represented simpler, happier times. But now, they felt like relics of a forgotten world, distant memories that were never meant to resurface. He tried to reason with himself. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe the long day, the stress of returning to the place where he and his father had spent so much time, had finally taken its toll. Maybe that was all it was. But deep down, he knew better. The figure he had seen, his father, was no hallucination. Stephen had spent the past 5 years trying to come to terms with his father's death. There had been nights when he lay awake, wondering if he had done enough, if he had told his father how much he meant to him before it was too late. And now, as the shadows around him thickened and the wind picked up, he realized that maybe his father wasn't done with him yet. He stood up slowly, the box tucked under his arm. His eyes scanned the trees, but there was no movement, no sign of anything unusual. The figure that had been standing across the lake was gone, but the eerie sensation remained. As he turned to head back to the campfire, a low sound reached his ears. At first, it was barely perceptible, like the whisper of leaves in the wind. But it grew louder, more distinct. It was a voice, and it was calling his name. Stephen! He froze, his heart thudding in his chest. The voice was familiar, achingly so. It was his father's voice, as clear as the day he had last heard it. But it couldn't be. His father was dead. Stephen shook his head, trying to rid himself of the thought, but the voice came again, louder this time. Stephen! It was coming from the lake. Slowly, almost against his will, Stephen turned and looked back at the water. The surface was still, smooth as glass, reflecting the dark sky above. But there, in the center of the lake, ripples began to form. Something was disturbing the water. He stepped closer to the edge, his feet crunching on the gravel. The ripples grew wider, more pronounced, as though something was moving just beneath the surface. And then, without warning, the water churned violently, as if something was rising from the depths. A figure emerged from the lake. At first, it was nothing more than a dark shape, a silhouette rising from the water's surface. But as it grew closer, Stephen's breath caught in his throat. It was his father, soaked, pale, his clothes clinging to his body as though he had just walked out of the lake. Water dripped from his hair, running down his face in rivulets. His eyes, those same eyes Stephen remembered so well, were fixed on him. Stephen couldn't move. His legs felt like they were made of lead, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. The figure stepped closer, the water parting around him, but there was no splash, no sound. It was as though the lake itself was making way for him. Stephen, the figure said again, his voice soft but insistent. Come here. Stephen shook his head, taking a step back. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. His father was dead, buried in a plot miles away from here. And yet, here he was, standing before him, as real as the fire crackling behind him. Come closer, the figure said, his voice taking on a commanding tone. There's something you need to see. Stephen's mind raced. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. But despite his fear, despite every instinct telling him to run, he found himself moving forward. His feet carried him closer to the water's edge, closer to the figure that looked so much like his father, but couldn't possibly be. Look into the water, the figure said, pointing down at the lake's surface. Stephen hesitated, his heart racing, but something compelled him to obey. Slowly, he knelt by the water's edge and gazed down into the depths. At first, all he saw was his own reflection, distorted by the ripples on the surface. But as he looked deeper, the reflection began to change. His face faded away, replaced by a different image, an image of his father, younger, standing by the lake with a fishing rod in hand, smiling. It was a memory, a perfect snapshot of a moment they had shared years ago. But then, the image shifted. The smile faded from his father's face, replaced by something darker. His eyes turned cold, distant. And then, behind him, a shadow appeared, a figure standing in the trees, watching them. Stephen's breath hitched. He didn't remember this. This wasn't how the memory had gone. But there it was, playing out before him like a scene from a nightmare. The shadow moved closer, and as it did, Stephen realized with a jolt that it wasn't just any shadow. It was him, his younger self, standing in the trees, watching his father. But something was wrong. The figure wasn't just watching, it was waiting for something terrible. The scene in the water twisted again, and suddenly, Stephen was back in the present. The lake was dark, and the figure, his father, was no longer by the fire. He was gone, replaced by the shadow that had haunted him in his reflection. Stephen gasped and stumbled back, the weight of the wooden box in his hands grounding him. The scene had dissolved, but the terror it left behind lingered, gripping him like a vice. The shadow wasn't just a memory. It was real. It had always been real. He remembered now, the day his father had taken him fishing, the last time they had been here together. He remembered the argument, the anger in his father's voice, the way Stephen had stormed off into the woods, vowing never to come back. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the secret he had buried along with his father's body. Stephen dropped to his knees, the truth crashing down on him with the weight of 1,000 stones. He had never told anyone, not even his mother, about what had really happened that day. The accident that had taken his father's life wasn't an accident at all. It was his fault. He had been so angry, so consumed by his own frustration that he hadn't noticed the loose rocks along the trail. His father had been walking ahead, trying to make peace when the ground gave way beneath him. Stephen had stood there, frozen, watching as his father tumbled down the hillside, crashing into the rocks below. By the time Stephen reached him, it was too late. His father was gone, his body broken and lifeless at the bottom of the hill. He had buried the memory deep, convincing himself that it had been an accident, that there was nothing he could have done. But now, here in the darkness, with the lake reflecting his worst fears back at him, the truth was undeniable. He had killed his father. The figure in the lake wasn't his father. It was something else, something that had been waiting for him all these years, lurking in the shadows of his guilt. And now, it had come to claim him. Stephen dropped the box into the water, watching as it sank beneath the surface. He felt the weight of it lift from his shoulders, but the guilt remained, a heavy, suffocating presence that threatened to pull him under. The figure on the shore didn't move. It simply stood there, waiting. Stephen closed his eyes, the sound of the water lapping at the shore filling his ears. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't run from the truth any longer. He couldn't hide from the shadow that had followed him all these years. With a deep breath, he stepped into the lake. The water was cold, biting at his skin as he waded deeper and deeper. The figure watched him, silent and still, as he moved closer. Stephen's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. When he reached the center of the lake, he stopped, the water lapping at his chest. The box had disappeared beneath the surface, swallowed by the dark depths below. And as Stephen stood there, staring into the face of the figure that had once been his father, he felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. He had come back to the lake to find closure, to confront the demons that had haunted him for so long. And now, as the water pulled him down, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had found it. Kao Tiu Je, haunted by guilt, a father's final message. Chiu Mota. What if the past you buried came back to life? One man's chilling encounter by the lake will leave you questioning reality.